Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today we are stepping back into one of the most volatile periods in ancient history. We're looking at the very beginning of Israel's monarchy to focus on a man who really fundamentally redefined what it meant to be a prince, Jonathan, the firstborn son of King Saul.
That's exactly right. And it's so interesting because when you read this story of David's rise, the focus is usually on Saul's failures or David's anointing.
Right, the big two.
Exactly. But Jonathan's life, which is captured with, surprising sharpness in the book of Samuel, it gives us something totally unique. It's a portrait of virtue and selflessness, just flourishing right in the middle of all this political chaos and conflict.
It really is.
Yeah, our sources are pretty clear on this. Jonathan stands as a kind of a moral blueprint. He's a model of faith that totally governed his courage, his loyalty, and this is the crucial part, his profound humility.
I think that humility is the key. It's the thing we really have to unpack today because it runs completely counter to everything we'd expect from royalty at that time.
Oh, completely.
So our mission for this deep dive is to give you a shortcut to understanding this incredible figure. We want to show how Jonathan didn't just survive these, days of national fragility, but how he actually defined them through his choices.
He faced a technologically superior enemy, a really unstable father, and yet he proved that the Lord isn't constrained by human arithmetic, that the divine math is just different.
And I think if there's one truth to carry through this entire discussion, it's this core conflict, right? Jonathan's story is about honoring God's anointed purposes, which he sees in David, even when those purposes are in direct opposition to his own destiny.
That's the whole story. He was the heir apparent. He was set to inherit the throne. But his real victory, his triumph, was in yielding that destiny without an ounce of resentment. He aligned himself with the true king's plan. That was the internal battle that he won.
Okay, so before we get into Jonathan's actions, his big moments, we have to ground ourselves in his world. I mean, the mud, the rock, the sheer scarcity of it all.
Absolutely. We're not in a settled, stable era here. This is a huge transition.
A political earthquake, really. It is. I mean, think about the magnitude of this shift. For centuries, Israel had existed as this decentralized, loosely organized group of tribes.
Right, led by judges like Samuel, kind of an as-needed leadership.
Exactly. Governance was sporadic and relied on these charismatic figures God raised up. But the people demanded a change. They looked around and said, we want to be like all the other nations.
They want a king.
We want a king, a visible central authority. And so the monarchy begins with Saul. And this huge political move, it creates immense social upheaval, and critically, it centralizes the military target for their enemies.
And their number one enemy, the Philistines, were not a minor threat. I mean, these guys were the regional superpower at the time.
They really were. The Philistines were this sophisticated coalition, often called the Sea Peoples, and their defining advantage was industrial. They had mastered ironworking.
So while the Israelites are sort of stuck in the Bronze Age, for the most part, yes, they're using softer metals, while the Philistines are forging iron tools and, more importantly, iron weapons. And that technological gap created this intense, continuous pressure on Israel's western frontier.
Wait, so this wasn't just a military advantage. If the Philistines controlled the iron, they could use that as a tactic of economic suppression.
That's precisely what our sources highlight. It was a deliberate strategy to keep Israel permanently weak. And this is where we get a truly shocking detail.
Okay.
The Philistines deliberately stifled Israel's ability to arm itself. They had an industrial monopoly, and they leveraged it. The text is incredibly specific on this point. Not a blacksmith could be found in the whole land of Israel.
Wow. Hold on. Not a single one. So that means they couldn't forge swords, obviously, but they probably couldn't even sharpen their plows or their axes without, going to a Philistine?
That's what it implies. It's a total economic chokehold. It was designed for absolute military and economic paralysis. You can't run a functional society without access to those basic tools.
And in wartime, that disadvantage is just catastrophic.
It's starkly symbolized in the text. On the day of a major battle, only 2 men in the entire Israelite fighting force possessed proper iron weapons, King Saul and his son Jonathan.
Just 2. In the whole army. The odds weren't just bad. They were, that's almost impossible.
It is. And that detail isn't just a historical footnote. It was a constant, visible reminder of their necessary dependence on God. Any victory they had couldn't be chalked up to superior numbers or better gear. It had to be divine intervention.
It magnified the risk of every move, but also the glory if they succeeded.
Precisely.
So let's talk about the geography too. Where is all of this action taking place?
We're focused primarily on the Benjaminite Hill Country. That's Saul's home turf. Places like Gibeah, Michmash, Geba. The area is characterized by these extremely steep ravines, deep valleys, rocky passes.
So rugged terrain. Good for defense, but tough for large armies to maneuver in.
Right. It required a very specific kind of warrior. Someone who understood how to use choke points, who wasn't afraid of scaling sheer rock faces, and who could handle close-quarters combat.
Which sounds a lot like Jonathan.
It's exactly Jonathan.
Yeah.
He was clearly that kind of fighter.
And in this fragile, disadvantaged nation, Jonathan has this huge political target on his back, even before David ever shows up.
Oh, absolutely. As Saul's firstborn, primogeniture makes him the natural heir. In the ancient Near East, that meant you had immediate power, but also immediate danger.
Right. Succession was a brutal business.
Vicious. Royal sons were expected to guard their position fiercely. That often meant eliminating rivals, even brothers or cousins. Ambition wasn't just a trait, it was a survival strategy.
So Jonathan was born into a culture where he was expected to be ruthless to secure his future.
Yes. Which makes his later choices, his willingness to yield his own crown, not just countercultural, it was politically revolutionary.
And we can't forget the spiritual atmosphere hanging over all of this. This wasn't just geopolitics, it was a theological experiment.
It was. Israel was still governed by the Mosaic Covenant. Their national security, their prosperity, it was all tied directly to their faithfulness to God's laws. The king wasn't supposed to be an absolute monarch. He was God's vassal.
And the prophet Samuel is there to remind him of that?
Constantly. Samuel acts as the spiritual check on the monarchy. He's always reminding Saul, often in very harsh terms, that obedience matters more than optics or expediency.
A test Saul repeatedly fails.
Repeatedly. He sacrifices impatiently. He refuses to fully carry out God's commands. But Jonathan, as we're about to see, he internalizes this truth, that spiritual obedience is the absolute prerequisite for any kind of national success.
Okay, so with that background, the scarcity, the terrain, the politics, we finally get to Jonathan's first major moment, an act of just sheer bravery that really defines him as a man of faith.
It starts at a place called Jeba, where Jonathan, on his own initiative, strikes a Philistine garrison.
A preemptive strike.
Exactly. It's a proactive move that immediately draws the full wrath of the Philistines. Meanwhile, Saul's army is demoralized. They're scattering. They're facing this impossible force. And that lack of weaponry is just palpable. Most leaders would be paralyzed.
But not Jonathan.
But not Jonathan. He sees the impossible situation and he decides to act from a place of conviction, not calculation.
He decides to risk everything, but it's not reckless. It's like he's testing God, seeing if God is willing to fight for Israel. And he does this with just one other person.
Just his young armor bearer. And this is where we get the core insight into Jonathan's soul. This is the defining theological confession that separates him from his father.
The famous quote.
The famous quote. He proposes this daring, almost suicidal approach to a massive Philistine outpost. And he says, "Perhaps the Lord will act in our behalf. Nothing can hinder the Lord from saving, whether by many or by few."
Nothing can hinder the Lord from saving. That's not bravado. That sounds like a fully formed theology of God's sovereignty. It's rooted in Israel's whole history.
It is exactly that. It's an explicit rejection of the military math of his day. A conventional commander looks at the situation, no iron weapons, 2 guys against a garrison, and says, "This is impossible. We need more troops."
Right. Retreat, regroup.
Jonathan looks at the same situation and says, "Our resource deficiency is irrelevant because God is our resource." He is anchoring his courage in the Lord's identity as a divine warrior. He gets it. God isn't limited by our stuff.
So his faith isn't blind. It's anchored in what he knows about God's character, which suggests that genuine faith, maybe, shows up most clearly when the visible resources are at zero.
That's it. It proves the truth we see in the Psalms, right? Some trust in chariots and some in horses, but we trust in the name of the Lord. Jonathan didn't need more swords. He needed God to show up. And that theological confidence allowed him to move beyond fear.
And he turns this radical idea into a clear providential test. He doesn't just charge in.
No, he shows this prayerful submission. He tells his armor bearer they'll wait for a sign. If the Philistines say, "Come up to us," they'll take it as confirmation that God has delivered the enemy into their hands.
But if they say stay put, they'll back off.
They'll back off. The test is precise. It's measurable. He's not just acting on impulse.
And the sign comes. The Philistines see these 2 guys climbing up the crags and basically taunt them. "Come on up, we'll teach you a lesson."
They essentially invite their own destruction. And Jonathan and his armor-bearer immediately take that as divine permission. They scale the rocks, and in that small, defensible space, they cut down about 20 men.
But that's not the real victory, is it? It's bigger than that.
Not at all. Their personal strength is just the catalyst. The text says the Lord sends a panic through the entire Philistine camp, and it's magnified by an earthquake that just spreads confusion and terror.
An earthquake. I mean, that is a truly spectacular biblical intervention.
It is. The fear is palpable. The Philistines start fighting each other in the chaos. They think they're being attacked from all sides. So the Israelite army rallies, even former deserters. Seeing the chaos, they return and join the battle.
So Jonathan's single act of faith created the opportunity, and then God's power turned 2 men into a national deliverance.
That's the story.
Okay, so we see Jonathan's clarity and faith. Now, let's look at the immediate contrast with his father. Because this incredible victory is achieved by faith, but Saul almost ruins the entire day with his impulsivity.
This is the critical tension in the chapter. Saul's leadership is focused entirely on external religiosity, projecting power.
Yeah.
So in his rashness, he issues this debilitating oath.
Right, he forbids the troops from eating until evening.
Yes, supposedly to gain a greater victory through fasting. But the oath completely disregards the physical exhaustion of the soldiers. It actually endangers their lives, and later it causes them to sin because they become so ravenous they eat meat without draining the blood.
And Jonathan, who's been out fighting for his life, is completely unaware of this oath. He finds some honey.
He finds wild honey dripping from a honeycomb. And it's such a beautiful, small, humanizing moment. He dips his staff, he tastes it, and the text says, his eyes brightened.
I love that detail.
It's so vivid. You can just imagine the exhaustion, the adrenaline crash. That honey wasn't just a snack, it was life. It was an instant energy boost that exposed the sheer folly of Saul's self-serving oath.
So it wasn't an act of rebellion on Jonathan's part. It was just an act of survival that happened to violate this rigid, frankly dumb rule.
Exactly. But when Saul finds out about this technical violation, his focus shifts. It's not about celebrating the miraculous victory anymore. It's about prosecuting a breach of his own ritual.
And he demands execution for his own son, the hero of the day.
He prioritizes his own flawed oath, his own sense of kingly authority over the life of the man God just used to save the entire nation. It's just a stunning failure of leadership.
But the people step in. They actually defend Jonathan against their own king.
They do. And their defense is paramount. They insist he must not die because, quote, with God's help, he has brought about this great deliverance.
It's a direct rebuke to Saul.
A sharp one. Saul was fixated on rules and the optics of kingship. Jonathan was submitted to God's revelation and simply acted in faith. And the people, the common soldiers, they recognized who the true hero was. They chose faith over the king's rigid law.
Okay, so that shows us Jonathan, the warrior of faith. But the next section is where he risks everything politically for a friendship.
And the transition from warrior to friend is seamless, because it's driven by the exact same theological insight. The story shifts right after David defeats Goliath.
Another underdog victory.
And how does David fight? Not with iron, but in the name of the Lord Almighty. Jonathan hears that, he sees David's confidence, and he recognizes a kindred spirit.
He sees himself in David.
He does. He recognizes that David has the same core conviction he had at Michmash. The battle belongs to the Lord. He doesn't see a political rival. He sees a divine anointing that he understands is going to reshape the entire kingdom.
And he's just immediately drawn to him.
Immediately and deeply. The text says Jonathan became one in spirit with David, and he loved him as himself. This is the start of that covenant of friendship.
And he formalizes this friendship with these incredibly powerful symbols. He gives David his own robe and weapons.
We just cannot overstate the significance of those gifts. In that culture, these weren't just tokens of affection. They were symbols of status, of rank, and crucially, of potential succession.
The royal robe, his own armor.
These were the signs of the heir apparent. And remember, the weapons were the iron weapons. There were only 2. By giving these items away, Jonathan was symbolically, publicly, yielding his own claim to the throne.
He was essentially saying, God has chosen you, not me.
Yes, my identity is not tied to this office. He voluntarily gives up the signs of his birthright for the sake of God's plan, even though that plan means his own demotion. It's an unimaginable level of humility for a royal heir.
Just a radical non-attachment to power.
Exactly. Most political figures are defined by what they gain. Jonathan is defined by what he willingly gives away.
But this powerful bond is immediately tested by, the dark, unstable personality of his father. Saul's jealousy becomes a real danger.
It escalates dramatically after the women start singing that refrain. Saul has slain his thousands, and David his tens of thousands.
That public comparison just drives Saul into a paranoid rage.
He stops seeing David as an asset and starts seeing him as this existential threat to his legacy. And Jonathan is forced into the role of mediator. He's constantly speaking well of David, trying to urge his father not to sin by shedding innocent blood.
That must have been an agonizing position to be in, choosing fidelity to his friend and to God's anointed over the blood loyalty he owes his father, and frankly, over his own self-preservation.
The cost was immense. He was risking his father's wrath every single day. He chose to stand in the gap, not just for David, but for the moral integrity of the kingdom. He just refused to participate in Saul's moral spiral.
And that leads to the definitive, horrifying breaking point, the spearing incident.
The friends devised that test at the New Moon Festival to finally confirm Saul's intentions. And when Jonathan defends David's absence at the feast, Saul's rage just boils over. He attacks his own son.
Let's slow down on that. Hurling a spear at your own child. That is a stunning act of disintegration. Was he actually trying to kill him, or is this just uncontrollable fury?
It was a paroxysm of anger, yes, but it was also a political message. Saul was furious that his own heir was siding with the rival. By throwing the spear, he was sending a clear, violent signal. You align with David, you risk everything, including your life.
He was basically telling Jonathan to secure his own future by hating David.
Exactly. But Jonathan doesn't back down. He just leaves the table.
And the text says he's grieved and ashamed.
Yes, but notice he's ashamed of his father's dishonor, not for himself being attacked. He's ashamed by his father's moral failure. He realizes in that moment that the breach between the house of Saul and the purposes of God is total. It's irreparable.
And the narrative then moves to their final, poignant meeting in the field to renew that covenant.
They meet. They weep. It's this deep expression of their shared sorrow. And they renew their covenant before the Lord, crucially extending the bond to their descendants forever.
They're thinking long-term, beyond their own lives.
They are. And then we get the ultimate statement of yielded ambition. The scene in the wilderness where Jonathan seeks David out one last time.
Not for his own benefit, but to strengthen his friend.
Right. Jonathan risked his life to find David, who's in hiding. He doesn't try to negotiate a deal. He doesn't try to jockey for position. Instead, he helped him find strength in God, and then he says it. He affirms God's decree over his own life. You will be king over Israel, and I will be second to you.
Let that statement just sink in. The rightful heir is not just stepping aside. He's offering to be the lieutenant to his successor.
It is unparalleled, radical political selflessness. He yields without any resentment. He chooses honor, fidelity to the Anointed One over the self-ambition that was expected of him. He proves that true friendship rejoices in the advancement of the other, even if it means your own demotion.
So we've charted the history, the narrative. Now we need to synthesize this. What does Jonathan's life teach us about faith, about how to conduct ourselves under pressure?
Well, the whole story gives us this robust theology of divine sovereignty. Jonathan's confession at Michmash is the anchor. Nothing can hinder the Lord by many or by few. His life confirms that God doesn't need our numbers, our resources, or our technology to achieve his purposes.
The focus shifts entirely from human capacity, the arithmetic of soldiers and swords, to God's infinite ability. His victory is a living illustration that God's power is made perfect in our weakness.
Exactly. Faith gets the glory, not our superior planning or armament. Jonathan models a faith that is active and intellectual. He acts because he knows God's character, not just because he feels brave that day. His courage flows directly from his theology.
Okay, let's break down the practical applications. Application 1. Courage flows from theology, not just temperament. What does that look like in daily life?
It means modeling what we could call prayerful initiative. We all face scarcity, right? Time, money, opportunities. The temptation is either to despair and retreat or to try and manipulate an outcome. Jonathan models the third way.
Which is?
Take the next faithful step, the one that's informed by what you know God has commanded or promised, and then you leave the ultimate outcome, the victory, to the Lord.
So the scale of the obedience matters less than the heart behind it. You might be just crossing a small ravine with one friend, but if it's done in faith, God can use it to move mountains.
Precisely. We shouldn't despise the day of small things. Small obediences, scaling that pass, having that difficult conversation with integrity can become the very hinge of larger deliverances. We act in the small, believing in a great God.
Okay, application 2 deals with that excruciating tension Jonathan faced, navigating family pressure while trying to live with integrity. This is incredibly relevant.
It's a high-stakes lesson. Jonathan models honor toward his father. He stays loyal, he fights for him, but he draws a hard ethical line. He refuses to join him in sin, specifically in the plot to murder David.
When blood loyalty collides with fidelity to God's will, he chooses God's will.
He does. And that's radical in a patriarchal society. But it anticipates that maxim from the New Testament. We must obey God rather than human beings. His refusal wasn't rebellion for rebellion's sake. It was a clear, unyielding commitment to God's anointed and God's purpose.
Application 3, covenant loyalty and friendship.
Jonathan's love for David models a truly mature bond. It protects, trusts, hopes, perseveres. He loved David as himself, which meant he didn't see David's advancement as a threat to his own identity.
In a world where so many relationships are transactional.
Exactly. We relate based on what we can get. Jonathan challenges that. He keeps his word, he risks his position, and, most remarkably, he genuinely rejoices when God advances his friend's calling beyond his own. It's the antithesis of professional envy.
He wasn't just tolerating David's rise, he was actively facilitating it.
That is the ultimate test of a non-transactional friendship. He found his joy in aligning with God's will, even when that meant his own decrease.
And finally, application 4 brings us back to that central tension, humility versus ambition.
Jonathan invites us to lay all our ambitions before the Lord. He had every reason to scheme and plot against David to secure the throne. Instead, he chose to yield. His statement, "You will be king and I will be second to you," becomes the model for a consecrated ambition.
It's about working faithfully in the role you have, without obsessively trying to clutch a position you weren't meant to hold.
Exactly. He modeled the humility that in honor prefers the other. We're freed from the crushing weight of having to manipulate outcomes when we trust the Lord who exalts the humble. Jonathan's posture echoes John the Baptist centuries later. My joy is complete when he increases, even if I decrease.
It's easy, though, to look at Jonathan's life and see him as, in worldly terms, a magnificent failure. He never got the throne, he never saw the kingdom David built, and he died tragically on the battlefield.
That's the worldly assessment, and it's factually true. His final appearance is his death on Mount Gilboa, fighting alongside his father as the Philistines finally overwhelm the Israelite forces. The first royal dynasty ends in violence and defeat.
And David receives this news with just immense grief. His lament is one of the most poignant passages in the entire Old Testament.
Oh, it's heartbreaking. David honors him with such tenderness. I grieve for you, Jonathan, my brother. You were very dear to me. Your love for me was wonderful. It confirms their covenant was real, it was pure, and it was selfless.
But the true power of Jonathan's faithfulness, the legacy of his yielded ambition, doesn't even show up until years later when David is secure on his throne.
Yes, this is the ultimate payoff, the final act of grace that makes his story so significant. Years into his reign, David remembers the covenant he made with Jonathan. He seeks out Jonathan's surviving family, specifically his son Mephibosheth.
And we need to put this action in its cultural context. This wasn't just a nice thing to do. This was a deeply risky, almost revolutionary act for a king.
It was contrary to every political custom of the day. When a new dynasty took power, the first thing the new king did was systematically eradicate every surviving member of the previous ruling family.
To prevent future coups?
Standard practice. Mephibosheth, as a grandson of Saul, should have been executed.
Yet, David seeks him out. He finds him in hiding, crippled from an accident.
And David not only spares him, he restores Mephibosheth's family lands, and most significantly, he grants him a permanent place at the royal table. It is a complete, undeserved elevation from political outcast to family member.
And the reason David does this is the crucial part.
The reason is specified right there in the text. It was done for Jonathan's sake. This profound act of mercy was anchored entirely in the covenant Jonathan had made decades prior. His faithfulness created a legacy of mercy for his own descendant that he himself never lived to see.
That illustrates a powerful theological pattern that resonates far beyond ancient politics.
It absolutely does. The sources draw a clear parallel to the gospel. David's favor toward Mephibosheth is undeserved, unearned, and anchored in Jonathan's commitment. In the same way, we receive blessing, a place at the royal table, not because of our own merit, but for the sake of Christ, the greater Son of David.
That has to be so reassuring for anyone who feels like they're serving in the shadows or that their quiet, faithful decisions aren't bearing any visible fruit right now.
It is the ultimate reassurance. Jonathan never received the visible crown, yet his faithfulness shaped David's mercy years later. His life reassures us that the Lord sees and remembers our faithful acts, even if those acts bear fruit far beyond our own sight or our own lifetime.
So synthesizing this whole deep dive, Jonathan's life is really a masterclass in consecrated courage, covenant friendship, and cheerful submission. He showed that true honor isn't measured by possessing a crown, but by radical obedience to God's purpose.
He was the perfect example of a prince who knew he was not the king. And in that final humility, he points forward to Christ, the older son of David, whose lordship we're called to acknowledge. He invites us to that same glad surrender.
Let's leave you with this provocative thought to consider this week. Building on that profound story of Mephibosheth, Jonathan's choice of long faithfulness resulted in generational grace being shown to his own family decades after his death. So, how does choosing long faithfulness over immediate ambition today shape a legacy of mercy and covenant that extends far beyond what you can currently see or control?
Think about that long echo of faithfulness and who might be blessed by your integrity 20 years from now.
Thank you for diving deep with us. We'll see you next time.